The autumn mist rolled in from the Atlantic like clockwork, wrapping Port Alder in its familiar gray embrace. From his small boat repair shop on the harbor's edge, Jack Rourke could hear the gentle lap of water against weathered pilings and the distant cry of gulls circling the fishing boats returning with their morning catch. At 42, he'd found a rhythm in this quiet coastal town that suited him: predictable tides, honest work with his hands, and the kind of peace that came from being invisible. "Dad, you're doing that thing again," 16-year-old Leah called from the shop's doorway, her camera hanging around her neck like always. She had their late mother's observational eye, though she wielded it through a telephoto lens rather than words. "What thing?" Jack asked, not looking up from the outboard motor he was rebuilding. "That marine thing where you scan everything like you're expecting trouble." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She stepped inside, her boots echoing on the concrete floor. "Mrs. Callahan says you do it every morning when you walk to get coffee." Ruth Callahan lived in the Victorian house overlooking the harbor and had appointed herself the unofficial chronicler of Port Alder's daily rhythms. At 73, she noticed everything and forgot nothing, a trait Jack had learned to appreciate during their 3 years in town. "Mrs. Callahan talks too much," Jack said, but there was warmth in his voice. The old woman had been the first to welcome them after Ellen's death, bringing casseroles and asking no uncomfortable questions about why a Marine with 17 years of service had suddenly retired to fix boat engines. The shop door chimed again, and 14-year-old Noah bounded in with the restless energy of a freshman who'd rather be anywhere but school. His backpack hit the floor with a thud that rattled the tools on Jack's workbench. "Some kids were messing with Tommy Harrison again," Noah announced without preamble. "Those two jerks who wear the leather jackets with the snake thing." Jack's hands stilled on the motor housing. "What kind of messing?" "Shoving him around, taking his lunch money, the usual." Noah's jaw tightened, a gesture Jack recognized from his own reflection. "I told them to back off." Leah lowered her camera. "Please tell me you didn't start a fight on your second week of high school." "I didn't start anything. Just suggested they find someone their own size." Noah shrugged, but Jack caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "They backed down when Mr. Peterson came around the corner, but the bigger one said they'd remember me." The iron serpent patches Noah described weren't familiar to Jack, but then again he'd made it a point to avoid the kind of circles where gang colors mattered. Still, something cold settled in his chest. The old instinct that had kept him alive through 4 deployments in places where every shadow might hide a threat. "What did these kids look like?" Jack asked casually, returning to his work. Noah described 2 teenagers, both older and bigger than him, both wearing the leather jackets with red serpent emblems. The details came easily. Noah had inherited more of Jack's tactical awareness than either of them realized. That evening, as Port Alder settled into its familiar quiet, Jack walked the harbor district as he did most nights. The routine served dual purposes: exercise and reconnaissance, though he'd never called it that out loud. Tonight, he paid closer attention to the motorcycles parked outside Danny's bar, noting license plates and modifications with the unconscious efficiency of someone who'd once cataloged threats for a living. Miguel Santos was securing his boat rental office when Jack reached the marina's far end. The 2 men had served together in Afghanistan, though neither spoke much about those years. Miguel had found his own peace running day trips for tourists and weekend fishermen. "Heard Noah had some excitement at school," Miguel said without looking up from his lock. News traveled fast in a town of 3,000. Jack nodded, watching a scarred tomcat emerge from between 2 overturned dinghies. The locals called him Harpoon, a battle-tested survivor who'd claimed the harbor as his territory through sheer stubbornness. "Kids being kids," Jack replied. Miguel straightened, meeting his eyes. "Maybe. Heard there's been more bikes in town lately, different faces asking about local businesses." The cat padded closer, one ear torn from some long-ago fight, yellow eyes unblinking in the harbor lights. Jack had always felt a kinship with the animal, both of them scarred veterans who'd found sanctuary by the water. "I'll keep an eye out," Jack said. Back at the house, Leah was at her desk editing photos from the day, the blue glow of her laptop screen illuminating her concentrated expression. Noah sprawled on the couch, algebra homework forgotten as he channel surfed with the restless energy that seemed to define him. "Leah," Jack called softly. She looked up, and he nodded toward the front window. "You notice anything different on the street lately?" She followed his gaze, then reached for the telephoto lens beside her laptop. Through the window, she studied the quiet residential street with the same methodical attention she brought to her photography. "There was a bike parked under the broken streetlight last night," she said after a moment. "Chrome pipes, red accents. It idled there for about 10 minutes, then left when Mrs. Callahan turned on her porch light." Jack felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the recognition that the quiet life he'd built for his children might be under threat. But outwardly he remained calm, letting years of training govern his response. "Good eyes," he told Leah. "Maybe start keeping your camera handy when you're up here." She nodded, understanding passing between them without further words. Later that night, after both kids had gone to bed, Jack stood at his bedroom window, studying the street's shadows and sight lines. The house had been chosen carefully 3 years ago. Good visibility, multiple exit routes, neighbors close enough for help, but far enough for privacy. Now he found himself thinking tactically again, mapping distances and calculating fields of fire from muscle memory he'd hoped never to use. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the maple trees, their leaves whispering secrets to the darkness. Somewhere in that darkness, a motorcycle engine growled to life and faded into the distance. The quiet before was ending. The morning brought more mist and the familiar sounds of Port Alder awakening, fishing boats preparing for the day's work, the distant hum of traffic on Harbor Road, and Ruth Callahan's screen door creaking as she emerged to collect her newspaper. Jack arrived at his shop early, as always, finding comfort in the routine of checking his tools, reviewing the day's scheduled repairs, and brewing coffee on the small hot plate in the corner. He was 3 hours into rebuilding a Yamaha outboard when the bell above his door chimed with more force than usual. 3 men entered, their leather jackets and deliberate swagger immediately changing the shop's atmosphere. The lead man was built like a brick wall, broad shoulders, thick neck, and hands that looked more accustomed to breaking things than fixing them. His jacket bore the red iron serpent patch Noah had described. "You Jack Rourke?" The big man's voice carried the kind of casual menace that came from years of intimidating people. Jack continued working on the carburetor assembly, not looking up. "Shop's open. What can I do for you?" "Name's Brick. These are my associates, Tommy and Cruz." The man gestured to his companions, one thin and nervous, the other compact with dead eyes. "We represent certain business interests in the area." "I fix boat engines," Jack said, still focused on his work. "If you need something fixed, I can help. Otherwise, I'm pretty busy." Brick stepped closer, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. Jack noted the military-style construction, the way the man held his weight slightly forward. Ready for action, but not professionally trained. Street muscle, not soldier. "See, that's where you're wrong, Jack. Can I call you Jack?" Brick picked up a wrench from the workbench, hefting its weight. "These days, businesses need protection. Insurance, you might say. Against accidents." Jack finally looked up, meeting Brick's eyes with a kind of calm that could be mistaken for resignation by someone who'd never seen real danger. "What kind of accidents?" "Oh, you know, vandalism, theft. Sometimes people get hurt when they don't have proper protection." Brick set the wrench down deliberately. "Your boy Noah, he goes to the high school, right? Lot of accidents happen around schools these days." The temperature in the shop seemed to drop several degrees. Jack's hands continued their work, but every muscle in his body had shifted into a different mode. The coiled stillness of a predator deciding whether to strike. "My kids aren't part of any business discussion," Jack said quietly. "That's where you're wrong again," Brick grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "In our line of work, family is everything. Protection extends to everyone you care about. For a reasonable monthly fee, of course." Through the shop's front window, Jack caught a glimpse of movement across the street. Leah stood in the doorway of Peterson's Hardware, her camera raised discreetly. The girl had good instincts, staying hidden while documenting threats. "How reasonable?" Jack asked. "For a small operation like this? $300 a month. Cash, first of every month. Think of it as community support." Jack nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the proposal. In reality, he was cataloging details. Brick's dominant hand, the way Tommy kept checking the door, Cruz's habit of touching something under his jacket, the shop's layout from their perspective, potential weapons within reach, distance to the rear exit. "That's a lot of money for a small business," Jack said. Cost of doing business, my friend. Alternative's a lot more expensive. Brick leaned against the workbench, making himself at home. Accidents are unpredictable. Could happen to your shop, your house, your kids walking home from school. The bell chimed again, and Ruth Callahan bustled through the door carrying a covered dish. At 73, she moved with the determination of someone who'd survived 7 decades by refusing to be intimidated. "Jack, dear, I brought you some of those muffins you liked." She stopped short, taking in the 3 men with the sharp assessment of someone who'd seen plenty of trouble in her time. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had customers." "Just finishing up," Jack said smoothly. "Gentlemen, I'll need some time to think about your offer." Brick's jaw tightened at the interruption, but even street muscle knew better than to threaten elderly women in broad daylight. "Sure thing, Jack. Take all the time you need, but not too much time. Market conditions change fast around here." The 3 men filed out, Brick pausing at the door to look back. "Nice place you got here. Be a shame if something happened to it." After they left, Ruth set down her dish and fixed Jack with a stare that could have melted steel. "Those weren't customers." "No," Jack agreed. "They weren't. Same type that's been bothering Danny at the bar and the Hendersons at the tackle shop." She shook her head. 30 years I've been saying this town needed more police officers." Jack walked to the window, noting the way the 3 men split up as they reached their motorcycles. Professional enough to avoid clustering, amateur enough to use predictable escape routes. Through the glass, he saw Leah emerge from her hiding spot, camera still in hand. "Mrs. Callahan, you might want to vary your routine for a while. Maybe ask your nephew to check on you in the evenings." She studied his face with the shrewd intelligence that came from decades of reading people. "You're not just a boat mechanic, are you, Jack?" "I fix engines," he said, "but sometimes you need different tools for different problems." That afternoon, as Jack finished the Yamaha repair, he found himself thinking about distance and angles. His shop sat at the harbor's edge, with clear sightlines to Harbor Road and the residential streets beyond. The second floor of the old Maritime Museum across the street offered elevation and concealment. The water tower behind the high school provided overwatch of the entire downtown area. He pushed the thoughts away. He wasn't that man anymore. He fixed boat engines and helped his kids with homework and lived a quiet life by the water. But as the sun set over Port Alder, painting the harbor in shades of gold and crimson, Jack found a serpent emblem carved into his shop's front door. The wood was fresh cut, the symbol still bright with sap. The message was clear. They knew where to find him. Standing in his doorway, Jack felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. For 3 years, he'd been Jack Rourke, the boat mechanic, Jack Rourke, the widowed father, Jack Rourke, who minded his own business and bothered no one. But carved into his door was a reminder of older truths. Some predators only understood one language. Some threats couldn't be reasoned with or ignored. As the harbor mist began to roll in with the tide, Jack made his choice. It was time to remember what he used to be. The old Maritime Museum had been closed for renovation since Jack arrived in Port Alder, its second-story windows boarded and forgotten. What the town planning committee didn't know was that the building's northeast corner offered a perfect view of Harbor Road, Main Street, and the approaches to both the residential district and the docks. At 02:00 hours, with the town settled into sleep and the fog providing natural concealment, Jack Rourke climbed through a loose board and took up a position he hadn't occupied in 3 years. Through mil-spec binoculars borrowed from gear Miguel had quietly moved from storage, Jack began mapping the iron serpent's operational patterns. Old habits returned like muscle memory, noting patrol timings, identifying communication methods, cataloging the hierarchy through body language and positioning. By dawn, he had confirmed what his instincts had warned him. This wasn't random gang expansion. The serpents moved with the disciplined coordination of ex-military personnel running a professional operation. "Dad?" Leah's voice came from behind him as the first fishing boats prepared to leave the harbor. "I brought coffee." Jack turned, unsurprised. His daughter had inherited more than her mother's eye for detail. She'd absorbed 3 years of living with someone who noticed everything. She would have tracked his absence, deduced his location, and approached with the same methodical patience he'd tried to teach both his children without them realizing it. "How long have you been watching?" he asked, accepting the thermos. "Long enough to see you're not just keeping an eye on things anymore." She settled beside him at the window, producing her camera with its telephoto lens. These might help. The photographs were remarkable. Clear images of license plates, faces, and tactical positions captured with the artistic eye that had won her 3 county photography contests. More importantly, they showed patterns Jack's overhead view had missed. The way the serpents used specific businesses as checkpoints, the rotation schedule for their street-level surveillance, the subtle hand signals that coordinated their movements. "When did you take these?" Jack asked, studying an image that showed a well-dressed man emerging from a black sedan to speak with Brick and 2 other gang members. "Yesterday afternoon and this morning. I've been documenting everything since Noah's incident at school." Leah zoomed in on the sedan's license plate. "The expensive car showed up around 5 yesterday. Driver stayed in the vehicle while the suit talked to your friend Brick." Jack studied the photograph with professional interest. The man in the expensive suit carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. His positioning relative to the gang members suggested he was giving orders, not receiving them. This confirmed Jack's growing suspicion that the Iron Serpents were the operational arm of a larger organization. "Leah, I need you to understand something," Jack said carefully. "The people we're watching aren't just troublemakers. They're dangerous professionals, and if they realize what we're doing, they'll escalate." She lowered her camera, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that reminded him painfully of Ellen. "I know, Dad. I've been watching you watch them for 3 days. You move differently now. You plan differently. This isn't about boat engines anymore." Before Jack could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Miguel, company at the docks. "Same players, different game." 20 minutes later, Jack and Leah occupied a concealed position behind stacked lobster traps near Miguel's boat rental office. The morning fog provided perfect cover as they observed Brick and 4 other serpents conducting what appeared to be a systematic canvass of the harbor businesses. Each conversation followed the same pattern: casual introduction, veiled threats, discussion of protection services. "They're not just running protection rackets," Leah whispered, adjusting her camera's focus. "They're gathering intelligence. Look at how the thin one keeps sketching in that notebook." Jack followed her observation. Tommy, the nervous member of yesterday's delegation, was indeed documenting details about each business: layouts, operating hours, security measures, employee schedules. Professional reconnaissance disguised as intimidation. "They're mapping the town," Jack realized. "Building a complete operational picture before they consolidate control." Miguel emerged from his office as the serpents approached, his movements casual but his posture indicating readiness. The conversation was brief and appeared cordial, but Jack recognized the tension in his old spotter's shoulders. When the gang members moved on, Miguel walked to his dock as if checking his boats, then made a subtle gesture toward the water tower. Message received, Jack thought. Miguel had spotted additional surveillance. An hour later, Jack used the harbor crane's maintenance ladder to reach an elevated position that confirmed Miguel's warning. 2 more serpents had positioned themselves near the high school, while a third watched the residential streets from the parking lot behind the medical center. The Iron Serpents weren't just establishing protection rackets. They were preparing for something larger. "Dad?" Leah's voice carried a note of urgency through his earpiece. "The expensive car is back, and there are more people with it." Jack adjusted his binoculars toward Main Street, where the black sedan had returned accompanied by 2 SUVs. The vehicles parked in formation that blocked traffic in both directions while their occupants emerged. The man in the suit from Leah's photographs was clearly in command, directing the newcomers with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to military precision. Through his scope, Jack counted 8 additional personnel, all carrying themselves with the disciplined bearing of ex-military contractors. Their positioning indicated advanced tactical training, overlapping fields of observation, coordinated communication, professional weapons handling evident in their subtle movements. The game had changed. What had begun as a local protection racket was revealing itself as something far more sophisticated. The Iron Serpents weren't just expanding into Port Alder. They were preparing to use it as a base for larger operations along the coast. Jack's phone vibrated with an encrypted text from a number he hadn't seen in 3 years but recognized immediately. Detective Mara Ellison, formerly of the Portland PD's Gang Task Force, now working the Coast Beat for the state police. "Coffee? Usual place. 1 hour. Come alone." The usual place was a reference to their last conversation 3 years ago, when Mara had helped Jack navigate the bureaucratic maze of relocating his family after Ellen's death. She'd been the one person in law enforcement who understood why a decorated Marine sniper might want to disappear into civilian life without questions. An hour later, Jack sat across from Mara in the back booth of Harbor Grounds, the coffee shop that served as Port Alder's informal community center. Mara looked older, her auburn hair showing gray at the temples, but her green eyes retained the sharp intelligence that had made her one of Portland's most effective detectives. "You know why I'm here," she said without preamble. "The iron serpents have attracted attention. Your attention, specifically." Mara studied his face with the intensity of someone reading a crime scene. "We've been tracking their expansion along the coast. 7 towns in 18 months, each one following the same pattern. They establish protection rackets, eliminate local competition, then use the territory as a logistics hub for larger operations." Jack sipped his coffee, noting the weight distribution that suggested Mara was carrying her service weapon in a shoulder holster, rather than her usual hip position. Someone was taking the serpents seriously enough to warrant enhanced caution protocols. "What kind of larger operations?" "Weapons trafficking, primarily. The kind of hardware that goes to the highest bidder, no questions asked." Mara leaned forward. "The suit you and your daughter photographed?" "Victor Kane. Former military contractor with connections to some very unpleasant people. He doesn't establish beachhead operations for small-time protection rackets." The confirmation settled Jack's remaining doubts about the threat level facing Port Alder. Kane wasn't just another gang leader. He was a professional with the resources and connections to turn their quiet coastal town into something far more dangerous. "What do you need from me?" Jack asked. "Information. Your particular skill set gives you access to intelligence we can't gather through normal channels." Mara's expression carried both respect and concern. "But Jack, if you're thinking about handling this yourself, don't. These people will kill you and your children without hesitation." As if summoned by her words, Harpoon appeared beside their table, the scarred tomcat regarding them with yellow eyes that seemed to catalog threats with the same instinctive wariness Jack recognized in himself. The cat had survived years of harbor conflicts through patience, intelligence, and the willingness to strike when survival demanded it. "I fix boat engines," Jack said quietly. "That's all." Mara nodded, but her eyes suggested she understood the deeper currents running beneath his words. "Just remember, some problems require official solutions. Don't try to be a one-man army." Walking back to his shop through the afternoon mist, Jack considered Mara's warning against the reality of what he'd observed. The iron serpents had already demonstrated their willingness to threaten children to control their parents. They'd carved warnings into his door and made it clear that his family was targeted for intimidation or worse. Official solutions required time, evidence, and bureaucratic processes that criminals like Kane exploited ruthlessly. By the time the system responded, Port Alder's quiet streets might be running with blood. That evening, as Jack helped Noah with algebra homework and listened to Leah edit photographs in her room, he made his decision. Mara was right about the dangers of acting alone, but she was wrong about his intentions. Jack Rourke wasn't planning to be a one-man army. He was planning something far more effective. He was going to turn Port Alder itself into a weapon, using every advantage the town's geography and community could provide. The Iron Serpents thought they were hunting sheep in a quiet coastal town. They were about to discover they'd wandered into a sniper's domain. The school bus had barely disappeared around the corner when Jack noticed the silence. Port Alder's residential streets carried sound differently in the autumn air. Children's voices, screen doors, the distant hum of lawnmowers preparing for winter storage. But Maple Street felt wrong, the kind of quiet that preceded storms or ambushes. Jack was replacing a fuel pump at Henderson's Marina when his phone buzzed with Leah's text, "Something's wrong at home, Noah's with me, coming to you." He set down his tools with deliberate care, muscle memory from a dozen combat zones taking control. The Marina offered multiple exit routes and clear sightlines, advantages he'd cataloged unconsciously during 3 years of honest work. Now those mental maps shifted from background awareness to active tactical consideration. 15 minutes later, both kids arrived on foot, Noah's face flushed with anger and Leah's camera hanging ready at her side. They'd approached through the harbor district rather than the direct route. Good instincts, Jack noted, even as his chest tightened with protective fury. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They trashed the porch, Noah announced without preamble. Red spray paint all over the front door and windows. Iron serpents own this street, and worse stuff about what happens to families that don't cooperate. Leah pulled up photographs on her camera's display screen. The images showed their quiet front porch transformed into a canvas of gang intimidation. Crude threats spray-painted across the door Jack had carefully restored when they'd first moved to Port Alder. Obscenities scrawled on the windows Ellen had once hung curtains behind. "There's more," Leah said quietly. "I was upstairs editing photos when I heard the motorcycles. 4 bikes, parked right in front like they owned the place. They spent maybe 10 minutes making noise, revving engines, making sure the whole neighborhood knew they were there." Jack studied the photographs with the analytical detachment that had once helped him identify targets at impossible distances. The vandalism wasn't random teenage destruction. It followed the systematic pattern of psychological warfare designed to isolate victims from community support. "Did anyone else come outside?" he asked. "Mrs. Callahan opened her door but didn't come out," Noah said. "The Petersons turned off their lights. Everyone just hid." The fear was spreading exactly as the iron serpents intended. Intimidate one family publicly, and the message reached every household on the street. Cooperation meant safety. Resistance brought consequences. "We were leaving through the back when the rock came through the living room window," Leah continued. "That's when I saw them riding away through the cemetery path." Jack's hands stilled on the camera. The cemetery path connected Maple Street to Harbor Road through a winding route that avoided main intersections, a perfect escape route for someone who'd scouted the area professionally. But it also revealed tactical thinking patterns Jack could exploit. "Show me exactly where they went," he said. An hour later, Jack crouched behind weathered headstones in Port Alder's cemetery, studying the motorcycle tracks that confirmed his suspicions. The iron serpents had used this route multiple times, wearing a clear path through grass that revealed their preferred approach and escape vectors. More importantly, the path funneled them through a natural choke point where the old cemetery road narrowed between stone monuments and oak trees. Harpoon emerged from behind a moss-covered mausoleum, padding silently through the afternoon shadows. The scarred tomcat's presence confirmed what Jack's tactical assessment had suggested. This was hunting ground, a place where predators moved with confidence because they controlled the terrain. But predators who used the same paths repeatedly became predictable, and predictable enemies were vulnerable enemies. That evening, Jack sat with his children at the kitchen table of their violated home, studying homework and photographs while his mind calculated angles and distances. Noah struggled with algebra problems, his usual focus scattered by anger and frustration. Leah worked on a photo essay about Port Alder's maritime heritage, her artistic eye capturing details that revealed the town's hidden geography. "I want to fight back," Noah said suddenly, looking up from his textbook. "I'm tired of hiding and letting them scare us." Jack met his son's eyes, seeing Ellen's determination mixed with his own stubborn courage. "What kind of fighting back?" "I don't know. Something. Anything." Noah's hands clenched into fists. "Tommy Harrison won't even look at me anymore. He's scared they'll come after him for talking to me. How is that fair?" "It's not fair," Jack agreed. "But fighting back doesn't always mean what you think it means." Leah looked up from her laptop. "What does it mean?" Jack considered his words carefully. His children had lived 3 years believing their father was simply a boat mechanic who'd once served in the military. They knew nothing about reconnaissance missions in Afghanistan, about targets eliminated from distances that turned men into mathematics, about the patient calculations that preceded precision strikes. "It means understanding your enemy better than they understand themselves," Jack said finally. "It means being smarter, not just tougher." "That's not fighting," Noah protested. "That's just thinking. Sometimes thinking is the most dangerous thing you can do to an enemy." Jack turned to a fresh page in Noah's notebook. "Want to learn a game?" Over the next hour, Jack taught his children what he called situational awareness exercises. games that involved memorizing details about their environment, tracking movement patterns, and identifying defensive positions. To Noah and Leah, it felt like spy training from a movie. To Jack, it was basic fieldcraft that might keep them alive. "Tomorrow, I want you both to notice 3 new things about the route to school," Jack instructed. "Exit points, hiding spots, places where you could call for help. Make it a competition. Whoever spots the most useful details wins." Noah's competitive nature engaged immediately. "What does the winner get?" "Survival," Jack said quietly. Later that night, after both children had gone to bed, Jack stood in his darkened living room surveying the damage to his home. The broken window had been temporarily covered with plywood, but the violation remained. Strangers had invaded his family's sanctuary, marked it with threats, and demonstrated their willingness to escalate violence. For 3 years, Jack had suppressed the part of himself that solved problems with precision and permanence. He'd built a new identity around fixing engines and attending parent-teacher conferences, burying the sniper under layers of civilian normalcy. But the Iron Serpents had made a critical error in their psychological warfare campaign. They'd assumed Jack Rourke was just another frightened civilian who could be intimidated into compliance. They had no idea they'd just threatened the family of someone who'd once been described in classified after-action reports as the most patient killer in the Marine Corps. Through his front window, Jack watched a motorcycle cruise slowly past for the 3rd time that evening. The rider's head turned toward the house, cataloging damage and gauging the effectiveness of their intimidation campaign. Jack stepped back from the window, disappearing into shadows with the fluid movement of someone who'd learned to become invisible in places where visibility meant death. The rider couldn't see him, but Jack could see everything: license plate, facial features, hand positions, the way the man favored his left side suggesting an old injury. Information was ammunition, patience was a weapon, and the Iron Serpents had just provided him with both the justification and the operational intelligence he needed to begin a very different kind of war. Tomorrow, Jack decided, it would be time to remind Port Alder's uninvited guests that some prey fought back with teeth they never saw coming. At 0347 hours, Brick Coulter sat in his truck outside Danny's bar, smoking his 4th cigarette and watching the empty streets of Port Alder through bleary eyes. The late-night surveillance shift was punishment duty, Kane's way of reminding him that the botched intimidation of the boat mechanic had been sloppy work. Professional operations required professional follow-through, and leaving Jack Rourke's family functional after marking them as targets suggested weakness. Brick crushed his cigarette against the dashboard and started the engine. One more pass through the residential district. Then he could return to the motel and catch 3 hours of sleep before the morning shift. The Iron Serpents maintained continuous presence in newly acquired territory, a lesson learned through expansion across 7 coastal towns where visibility equaled control. The truck's headlights swept across Harbor Road as Brick turned toward the cemetery path the gang used for discreet movement between districts. The route avoided main intersections where late-night police patrols might notice patterns, threading instead through the old section of town where streetlights were sparse and sightlines broken by mature trees. Brick was halfway through the cemetery when the first shot cracked across the darkness. The truck's rear window exploded inward, safety glass cascading across the seat as Brick instinctively ducked and floored the accelerator. Training from his army days kicked in. Incoming fire, direction unknown, immediate action drill was to move and find cover. A second shot punched through the hood with the distinctive whine of high-velocity rifle fire. The engine coughed, stumbled, then seized completely as coolant and oil painted the asphalt in dark streaks. Brick rolled from the disabled truck, using the chassis for cover while his mind processed tactical reality. Someone with serious skills had just disabled his vehicle with precision shots that could have killed him easily. The message was clear. This wasn't random violence, it was controlled demonstration. "Tommy, Cruz," Brick shouted into his radio, "contact at the cemetery, taking precision fire from unknown position." Static answered him. Either his backup was out of range or something had happened to their communications. A third shot sparked off the truck's frame inches from his head, the bullet's path suggesting the shooter held elevated position with clear sight lines across the cemetery's open ground. Brick low crawled toward the nearest headstone, his breathing harsh in the cold air as adrenaline flooded his system. But when he reached the granite monument and risked a look around its edge, the cemetery appeared empty. No muzzle flashes, no movement, no indication of where the shots had originated. Just autumn mist, drifting between the headstones and the sound of his own panicked breathing. Brick keyed his radio again. "Anyone copy? I need immediate backup at the old cemetery." This time, Tommy's voice crackled through. "Brick, what's your status?" We heard shooting. "Someone's got me pinned down with rifle fire, professional shooter, elevated position. Where the hell are you?" 3 blocks away. We'll be there in 2 minutes. But 2 minutes felt like hours as Brick hugged granite and waited for another shot that never came. When Tommy and Cruz finally arrived, their motorcycles roaring through the cemetery's narrow lanes, they found Brick crouched behind a headstone marked Ellen Rourke, beloved wife and mother. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. "You see the shooter?" Cruz asked, scanning the surrounding trees with the nervous energy of someone expecting imminent violence. "Never saw him. Professional work. Disabled my truck. Could have killed me any time he wanted." Brick stood slowly, using the headstone for cover. This was a message. Tommy examined the truck's damage with the eye of someone who'd seen combat. High-caliber rifle, precision shots. Hood and rear window taken out, but he missed you completely. "He didn't miss," Brick said grimly. "He hit exactly what he was aiming at." The 3 men spent 20 minutes searching the cemetery's elevated positions, finding nothing but tire tracks that led to Harbor Road and disappeared into normal traffic patterns. Whoever had conducted the attack had planned escape routes as carefully as shooting positions. Back at the Iron Serpent's temporary headquarters in a rented warehouse near the docks, Victor Kane listened to Brick's report with the controlled attention of someone who'd heard similar briefings in much more dangerous places. The operation room was sparse but functional. Folding tables, communication equipment, tactical maps of Port Alder marked with operational symbols. "Professional sniper," Kane concluded after Brick finished his account. "Military training, probably combat experienced." "He had you dead to rights but chose demonstration over elimination." "Could be cops," suggested Cruz. "Some kind of undercover operation." Kane shook his head. "Police don't conduct precision fire demonstrations in civilian areas. This was personal." He studied the tactical map, noting the cemetery's position relative to the Rourke residence. "Someone's protecting the boat mechanic's family." "Maybe Rourke's got connections we don't know about," Tommy offered. "Maybe," Kane agreed. "Or maybe Rourke is more than he appears." Kane had built his reputation on reading people and situations accurately. 3 years of military contracting in hostile territories had taught him to identify threats before they became lethal problems. Jack Rourke's reaction to intimidation had been too calm, too controlled. The man moved like someone comfortable with violence, even if he chose not to display it. Now someone with serious skills was sending messages through precision gunfire. Either Rourke had called in favors from his military past, or the boat mechanic was conducting his own operations under cover of civilian anonymity. "Double the surveillance on the Rourke family," Kane ordered. "I want eyes on them 24 hours a day, and check Rourke's military records, if we can access them. Man who stays that calm under pressure might have interesting history." Brick shifted uncomfortably. "What about the shooter? What about him?" Kane's voice carried the cold pragmatism that had kept him alive through a dozen military conflicts. He made his point. Now we make ours. But privately, Kane felt the first stirrings of concern that had nothing to do with tactical considerations. Professional snipers didn't emerge from quiet coastal towns without reason. Someone had just demonstrated the ability to kill his personnel at will, choosing restraint over elimination for purposes Kane didn't yet understand. In his experience, restraint from a position of strength was the most dangerous threat of all. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away in Jack Rourke's darkened garage, Miguel Santos carefully cleaned and stored the rifle that had just sent the Iron Serpents their first real message. The weapon had never left its case during Jack's 3 years of civilian life, but muscle memory made the maintenance routine feel like yesterday. "Clean shots," Miguel observed, his voice carrying the professional satisfaction of a job completed correctly. Jack nodded, studying tactical maps of Port Alder spread across his workbench. Red pins marked known Iron Serpent positions, blue pins indicated friendly resources, green pins showed potential operational sites. The pattern emerging looked like every urban warfare scenario he'd trained for. But this time, the battlefield was his adopted hometown, and the stakes included his children's safety. "How long before they figure out it wasn't random?" Miguel asked. "They already know," Jack replied. "Kane's too smart to believe in coincidences. Question is what he does with that information." Through the garage window, Harpoon padded across the backyard with the confident stride of an apex predator in familiar territory. The scarred tomcat paused beneath the maple tree, yellow eyes scanning shadows for threats that existed only in feline instinct. Jack understood the feeling. For 3 years, he'd suppressed the predatory awareness that had kept him alive through 4 combat deployments. Now that awareness was fully operational again, cataloging threats and calculating responses with the methodical precision that had once made him the most feared sniper in his unit. The Iron Serpents thought they were hunting sheep in a quiet coastal town. They were about to learn the difference between predator and prey. The morning fog hung thick over Port Alder's harbor district, reducing visibility to 20 yards in muffling sound until the world felt wrapped in gray cotton. Jack moved through the maze of piers and warehouses with the fluid silence of someone who'd learned to become invisible in places where detection meant death. 3 years of honest work among these docks had given him intimate knowledge of every sightline, every hiding spot, every tactical advantage the harbor offered. Now that knowledge was becoming weaponized. From his position atop the old fish-packing plant, Jack watched through binoculars as the Iron Serpents attempted to establish their morning patrol pattern. Brick and 2 associates moved between businesses with the systematic approach of soldiers clearing hostile territory, but their urban warfare training hadn't prepared them for an environment where every shadow might conceal a threat. Jack's radio crackled with Miguel's voice. 3 bikes heading toward the marina, Kane's in the passenger seat of a black SUV hanging back about 2 blocks. "Copy," Jack responded. "Leah, you in position?" "Second floor of the Maritime Museum," his daughter's voice confirmed. "I've got telephoto coverage of Harbor Road and both dock approaches." The morning's operation was as much about training his team as disrupting the enemy. Noah crouched beside Jack on the rooftop, learning to read tactical movement through binoculars while remaining invisible to ground-level observation. 3 days of situational awareness games had awakened natural instincts Jack recognized from his own military development. "Dad, the guy with the notebook is separating from his group," Noah whispered, tracking Tommy's movement toward the fuel dock. "Good eyes. What's he doing?" Noah adjusted his binoculars. "Taking pictures of the storage tanks, writing stuff down. He's mapping fuel supplies." The observation confirmed Jack's analysis of Iron Serpent methodology. They weren't just running protection rackets. They were conducting comprehensive intelligence gathering for larger operations. The fuel dock could service vessels much larger than Port Alder's fishing fleet, making it valuable for smuggling operations or weapons transfers. Jack keyed his radio. "Miguel, can you create some misdirection at the fuel dock? Our friend with the notebook needs to see something that isn't there." "Copy. Give me 3 minutes." Miguel's misdirection came in the form of a carefully staged argument with Danny Morrison, the dock supervisor, about fuel delivery schedules. Their raised voices carried across the water as Miguel gestured dramatically toward storage tanks that were actually empty, claiming they contained aviation fuel for seaplane operations that existed only in the conversation. Tommy dutifully recorded the false information while Jack smiled grimly. Intelligence based on deception was worse than no intelligence at all. It led to operational planning that failed catastrophically when reality contradicted expectations. "Leah, you getting pictures of the documentation?" Jack asked. "Every page. I could enhance them later to see what he's writing." The Iron Serpents spent 2 hours mapping the harbor district, unaware that their every movement was being observed and documented. Jack used the time to teach Noah advanced fieldcraft, how to predict enemy movement through terrain analysis, how to identify command relationships through body language, how to remain invisible by controlling breathing and minimizing unnecessary motion. "Why don't we just call the police?" Noah asked during a lull in activity. "What would we tell them? That some men on motorcycles are taking pictures and asking questions?" Jack lowered his binoculars. "They haven't technically broken any laws Detective Ellison could act on. But we know they're planning something bigger. Knowing and proving are different things." Jack studied his son's frustrated expression. "Sometimes you have to wait for the enemy to reveal their true intentions before you can respond effectively. That sounds like letting them make the first move." Sometimes the first move is letting them think they're winning. By noon, the fog had lifted enough to reveal the Iron Serpent's next tactical error. Kane's SUV had positioned itself in the Maritime Museum parking lot. Excellent visibility for command and control, but also maximum exposure to elevated observation. Through his scope, Jack could see Kane reviewing intelligence reports while speaking into a satellite phone. The conversation lasted 12 minutes, during which Jack's directional microphone captured enough keywords to understand the general content. Kane was reporting to superiors about Port Alder's suitability for expanded operations, specifically mentioning the harbor's capacity for larger vessels and the local population's apparent compliance with intimidation tactics. What Kane didn't realize was that his excellent vantage point put him directly in the crosshairs of a marksman positioned 300 yards away with clear sight lines and perfect concealment. Jack could have ended the Iron Serpent threat with a single shot. Kane's death would scatter his organization and eliminate the immediate danger to Port Alder's residents. But elimination wasn't the objective. Not yet. The goal was psychological warfare, making the enemy defeat themselves through escalating paranoia and tactical mistakes. "Leah, I need you to take some pictures of Kane's vehicle from your position," Jack instructed. "Already on it. License plate, occupants, communication equipment visible through the windows." 20 minutes later, Kane's phone rang. The conversation was brief but intense, ending with Kane shouting orders at Brick before the SUV departed at high speed toward Harbor Road. "Miguel, what just happened?" Jack asked. "Anonymous tip to the state police about suspicious vehicles conducting surveillance near the harbor," Miguel replied with barely concealed satisfaction. "Mention specific license plate numbers and possible weapons violations." Jack smiled grimly. Kane would spend the rest of the day wondering who had called in the tip and how his vehicle identification had been compromised. The Iron Serpents were beginning to experience the psychological pressure of being watched by unseen observers, the same pressure they'd been applying to Port Alder's residents. That evening, as Jack helped Noah with homework and listened to Leah edit her photographs, he reflected on the day's tactical lessons. The Iron Serpents were professional enough to be dangerous, but predictable enough to be defeated. Their military training made them effective against conventional opposition, but it also created patterns Jack could exploit. More importantly, his children were adapting to their new reality with the resilience that had carried the Rourke family through 3 years of rebuilding after Ellen's death. Noah's competitive nature was channeling into tactical awareness, while Leah's artistic eye was proving invaluable for intelligence gathering. "Dad," Leah said, looking up from her laptop, "I enhanced the photos of what Tommy was writing. He's not just mapping the harbor, he's documenting defensive positions and escape routes." Jack studied the enhanced images, noting the systematic approach to tactical planning that confirmed his worst suspicions. The Iron Serpents weren't preparing for simple criminal operations. They were planning for armed conflict with law enforcement response. "They're expecting a fight," Noah observed, reading over Jack's shoulder. "Yes," Jack agreed. "The question is whether they're planning to start one, or whether they think someone else will." Through the kitchen window, Harpoon stalked across the backyard in pursuit of some unseen prey. The scarred tomcat moved with the patient confidence of a predator who understood that successful hunting required perfect timing. Too early, and the prey escaped. Too late, and the opportunity vanished. Jack recognized the feeling. The Iron Serpents were revealing their operational plans through systematic reconnaissance, but they hadn't yet committed to actions that would justify decisive response. The moment was approaching when patience would transform into precision, but that moment hadn't quite arrived. Tomorrow, he decided, it would be time to accelerate their timeline. Predators who felt safe became careless, and careless predators made fatal mistakes. The convoy of black SUVs rolled into Port Alder at dawn like a mechanized invasion force, their tinted windows and coordinated movement announcing the arrival of serious reinforcements. From his observation post atop the water tower, Jack counted 12 new personnel as they emerged from the vehicles with the disciplined precision of military contractors. These weren't street-level gang members. They carried themselves with the confident bearing of professionals who'd operated in much more dangerous environments than a quiet coastal town. Victor Kane stood in the Maritime Museum parking lot directing the newcomers, deployment with crisp hand signals that spoke of shared military experience. Through his scope, Jack recognized the tactical formations, overlapping fields of observation, communication protocols, weapons positioning that turned Port Alder's downtown district into a controlled operational zone. "Dad, these guys are different," Noah whispered from his position beside the radio equipment. 3 days of intensive fieldcraft training had sharpened his observational skills to the point where he could read professional competence through binoculars. Ex-military contractors, Jack confirmed, studying the way the reinforcements moved through tactical positions. Probably worked overseas conflicts, now freelancing for whoever pays best. The implications were sobering. The Iron Serpents had evolved from a regional gang into the operational arm of something much larger and more dangerous. Kane's phone conversation with superiors had apparently convinced someone that Port Alder required professional-grade personnel to complete whatever mission they'd been assigned. Jack's radio crackled with Miguel's voice from the harbor. "The new boys are carrying serious hardware under those jackets. Military-grade communication gear, coordinated positioning, someone's expecting resistance." "Copy. Leah, what are you seeing from the museum?" Kane's briefing them with maps and photographs. His daughter's voice replied from her concealed position in the abandoned building's second floor. "I can see our house in some of the pictures, and the harbor district. They're planning coordinated operations." The confirmation settled Jack's tactical assessment. The Iron Serpents weren't just running protection rackets anymore. They were preparing for armed conflict with whatever opposition they expected to encounter. The question was whether that opposition was law enforcement response or the mysterious sniper who'd been harassing their operations. Jack keyed his radio again. "Miguel, initiate Phase 2. Time to give our guests something to think about." Phase 2 was psychological warfare elevated to art form. Over the next 4 hours, the new arrivals experienced the gradually mounting pressure of being observed by threats they couldn't locate or eliminate. Radio communications suffered mysterious interference that turned tactical coordination into confused static. Vehicle tires developed slow leaks that stranded patrol units in predictable locations. Equipment malfunctions occurred with suspicious timing that suggested sabotage without providing evidence of specific perpetrators. The centerpiece of the operation was Jack's network of decoy sniper positions, carefully prepared shooting nests in obvious locations that would draw attention and waste enemy resources. Miguel had spent 2 nights placing rifle rests, spent brass casings, and other evidence that suggested multiple marksmen had been observing the town from elevated positions. "They're taking the bait," Leah reported, watching through her telephoto lens as 4 contractors methodically cleared the old grain elevator that overlooked Harbor Road. Full tactical sweep, treating it like a real threat. Jack smiled grimly. Professional soldiers were trained to eliminate sniper positions through systematic approach and overwhelming firepower. But eliminating empty positions accomplished nothing except wasting time and revealing their own tactical procedures to actual observers. By noon, Kane's reinforcements had cleared 6 decoy positions, finding evidence of surveillance but no actual snipers. The psychological effect was exactly what Jack had intended. Professional operators beginning to doubt their own competence while facing an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. Phase 3, Jack announced into his radio. Phase 3 introduced the element that separated psychological pressure from genuine terror, phantom gunfire. Using a network of improvised noisemakers positioned throughout the downtown district, Jack created the illusion of coordinated sniper fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sound of high-velocity rifle shots echoed between buildings in patterns that suggested multiple shooters engaging targets from concealed positions. The contractors reacted exactly as their training dictated: immediate cover, radio communication, tactical movement toward suspected firing positions. But when they reached the sources of the phantom shots, they found only speakers and timers that had been triggered remotely. "Jesus Christ," Tommy's voice crackled over intercepted radio frequency. "How many of these guys are there?" Kane's response was sharp with frustration. "Maintain radio discipline. Someone's playing games with us." But Jack could hear the uncertainty beneath Kane's command voice. Professional operators understood the difference between games and genuine threats. Whoever was conducting these operations possessed detailed knowledge of military tactics and the technical resources to implement sophisticated deception protocols. From his position in the old Maritime Museum, Leah watched Kane study tactical maps with increasing agitation. The photographs she captured showed a commander whose confidence was eroding under pressure from an enemy he couldn't identify or engage. "He's starting to crack," she reported. "Keep looking over his shoulder, checking sight lines like he expects incoming fire." The paranoia was spreading through Kane's entire organization. Brick had taken to wearing body armor during daylight patrols, while the contractors moved with the hyper-vigilant awareness of soldiers operating in hostile territory. Port Alder's quiet streets had become a psychological battlefield where every shadow might conceal a threat. But Jack's most effective weapon wasn't tactical deception, it was information warfare conducted through the town's civilian population. Ruth Callahan had become an inadvertent intelligence asset, spreading carefully crafted rumors about mysterious men with rifles she'd supposedly glimpsed near the water tower. Danny Morrison mentioned overheard conversations about military snipers who'd been hired to protect local businesses. The rumors grew in the telling, transforming Jack's solo operation into an imaginary army of invisible defenders. By evening, half the town believed Port Alder was under the protection of professional soldiers, while the other half whispered about government agents conducting covert operations against organized crime. Kane's intercepted communications revealed the psychological pressure was achieving its intended effect. His superiors were demanding explanations for the operational delays and evidence of the opposition forces his reports described. But how could he explain being outmaneuvered by enemies who existed more in his imagination than in tactical reality? "We need to flush them out," Brick argued during an intercepted planning session. "Stop reacting and start hunting." "Hunt what?" Kane's frustration was audible even through encrypted radio. "We've cleared every position they might be using. Either they're ghosts or they're better than anyone we've faced." From his elevated position, Jack watched the contractors establish night security positions with the methodical precision of soldiers expecting imminent attack. Thermal imaging equipment, motion sensors, overlapping fields of fire. Everything necessary to defend against sniper assault, except the ability to target enemies who refuse to reveal themselves. The Iron Serpents had walked into the fundamental trap of asymmetric warfare. Superior firepower was useless against opponents who controlled the terms of engagement. They could clear buildings and establish perimeters, but they couldn't fight shadows and rumors that existed primarily in their own minds. As Port Alder settled into an uneasy evening, Jack allowed himself a moment of tactical satisfaction. The enemy was reacting instead of acting, wasting resources on phantom threats while revealing their own capabilities and limitations. But satisfaction was a luxury he couldn't afford for long. The contractor's presence escalated the stakes beyond simple intimidation tactics. These were men who'd killed professionally in foreign conflicts, now deployed in an American town with increasing desperation and decreasing restraint. Sooner or later, paranoia would transform into violence directed at civilian targets. Jack keyed his radio one final time. "Miguel, Leah, prepare for Phase 4. Tomorrow we stop playing games." Through his scope, he watched Harpoon emerge from the shadows near the harbor, the scarred tomcat moving with predatory confidence through territory he'd claimed through years of successful hunting. The parallel wasn't lost on Jack. Some battles were won through patience and precision rather than overwhelming force. But patience had its limits, and Port Alder's quiet streets were running out of time. The Iron Serpents' show of force began at precisely 1,400 hours, 12 motorcycles and 3 SUVs rolling down Main Street in formation designed to demonstrate overwhelming control of Port Alder's downtown district. Victor Kane had chosen the timing carefully. Maximum civilian visibility, business hours when shop owners and residents would witness the display of power that preceded final consolidation of territorial control. What Kane didn't realize was that his planned demonstration would become a carefully orchestrated trap. From his position in the old grain elevator, Jack watched the convoy approach through crosshairs that could have ended the operation with a single shot. But elimination wasn't the objective. Not yet. Today's mission was psychological demolition, using the enemy's own tactics to destroy their credibility and operational effectiveness. "Phase 4 is active," Jack announced into his radio. "All stations, initiate on my mark." The first element of the trap activated as the convoy passed the harbor district. Miguel triggered a sequence of boat horns that echoed across the water in the distinctive pattern military personnel would recognize as incoming artillery signals. The sound reverberated between buildings and off the water, creating an acoustic environment that suggested coordinated indirect fire from multiple positions. Kane's lid vehicle stopped immediately, its occupants scanning elevated positions for threats that existed only in sound and shadow. The motorcycles behind them clustered defensively, their riders displaying the nervous energy of soldiers who'd learned to fear what they couldn't see. Mark II, Jack transmitted. Phase 4's second element was pure theater designed to exploit professional paranoia. Throughout the downtown district, carefully positioned mirrors and reflective surfaces began creating brief, synchronized flashes that mimicked scope glints from concealed sniper positions. The effect was subtle but unmistakable to anyone trained in military reconnaissance, the characteristic signatures of multiple marksmen adjusting optical equipment for precision shots. "Jesus, how many are there?" Brick's voice crackled over intercepted radio frequency, his professional composure finally cracking under sustained psychological pressure. Kane's response was sharp. "Maintain formation. Do not break operational discipline." But discipline was exactly what Jack intended to shatter. Mark III, he transmitted. The downtown district erupted in coordinated chaos as every element of Jack's preparation came together in synchronized perfection. Store alarms triggered in sequence, creating overlapping waves of sound that made radio communication impossible. Traffic lights malfunctioned in patterns that trapped the convoy in predetermined positions while appearing completely random. Emergency sirens began wailing from multiple directions, suggesting massive law enforcement response to the Iron Serpent's public display. Through his scope, Jack watched Kane's carefully planned show of force disintegrate into confused retreat, as professional operators found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy who controlled every aspect of their operational environment. "Leah, you getting this?" Jack asked. Every second, his daughter replied from her position in the Maritime Museum. "Kane looks like he's seeing ghosts." The final element of Phase 4 was the most devastating. Detective Mara Ellison and 6 state police officers emerged from concealed positions with the precision timing of a military operation. But instead of engaging the Iron Serpents directly, they began systematic arrests of gang members who'd become separated during the chaos. The legal justification was airtight: weapons violations, outstanding warrants, parole infractions that Mara's investigation had documented over weeks of patient police work. But the tactical effect was psychological demolition as Kane watched his operational capacity disappear into police custody. "This is a setup," Tommy transmitted desperately. "Someone's coordinating with the cops." Kane's voice carried the frustrated rage of a professional who'd been outplayed by superior intelligence. "All units, immediate extraction. Repeat. Immediate extraction to Rally Point Alpha." But Jack's trap had one more layer. The Rally Point Alpha Kane referenced was the abandoned warehouse district, where the Iron Serpents had established their temporary headquarters. What Kane didn't know was that his encrypted communications had been compromised for days, giving Jack perfect intelligence about their planned escape routes. "Miguel, initiate the finale," Jack transmitted. As Kane's remaining vehicles fled toward the warehouse district, they encountered the psychological weapon that finally broke their operational effectiveness. The illusion of coordinated sniper fire from elevated positions that seemed to track their movement with impossible precision. The phantom gunfire wasn't real, but the psychological effect was devastating. Trained soldiers who'd survived actual combat found themselves paralyzed by threats they couldn't locate or engage. Vehicle after vehicle sought cover in positions that offered protection from imaginary shooters, while exposing them to very real police surveillance. From his elevated position, Jack watched Kane's SUV reach the warehouse district and screech to a halt behind what the gang leader believed was protective cover. Through his scope, Jack could see Kane screaming into his radio trying to coordinate a defense against attackers who existed primarily in his own imagination. "Noah, what do you see from your position?" Jack asked. His son's voice carried excitement mixed with tactical awareness. 3 vehicles abandoned on Harbor Road, occupants in full defensive positions. They're treating shadows like actual threats. The transformation was complete. Professional operators who'd arrived in Port Alder with confidence and superior firepower had been reduced to paranoid defenders seeing enemies in every sightline. Kane's carefully planned expansion had collapsed into psychological retreat through methods that left no evidence of actual resistance. But Jack's most effective weapon remained the civilian population whose protection had motivated every tactical decision. Throughout the downtown chaos, Port Alder's residents had emerged from businesses and homes to witness the Iron Serpent's public humiliation. Phone cameras captured gang members abandoning equipment and fleeing from threats they couldn't identify. The images would spread through social media within hours, destroying the Iron Serpent's reputation for invincibility while demonstrating that organized resistance was possible. Fear was a weapon that cut both ways. The same psychological pressure that had intimidated local businesses now worked against the gang members who'd believed themselves untouchable. Ruth's got the best view, Leah reported, watching their elderly neighbor document the chaos from her front porch. She's providing running commentary to half the neighborhood. Ruth Callahan's unofficial chronicles would ensure that every detail of the Iron Serpent's defeat became part of Port Alder's collective memory. The gang that had terrorized 7 coastal towns through systematic intimidation had been broken not by superior firepower, but by superior intelligence and community resistance. As evening settled over Port Alder, Jack conducted his tactical assessment from the water tower's elevated position. 6 Iron Serpent members were in police custody, their operational equipment scattered across downtown streets, their reputation for invincibility permanently destroyed. Kane's remaining forces had barricaded themselves in the warehouse district, but defensive positions were tactical dead ends that offered no path to mission success. The psychological campaign had achieved every objective Jack had established. Enemy forces degraded, civilian population emboldened, law enforcement positioned for final resolution. But success came with the recognition that Kane's desperate circumstances made him exponentially more dangerous. Cornered predators fought with the savage desperation of creatures who had nothing left to lose. "Miguel, Leah, Noah, prepare for final operations," Jack transmitted. "Kane's gonna make one last play, and it's going to be personal." Through his scope, he watched Harpoon pad across the harbor district with the confident stride of an apex predator who'd successfully defended his territory. The scarred tomcat had survived countless battles by understanding when to strike and when to withdraw, when to show strength and when to remain invisible. Jack recognized the wisdom in that approach. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, but tonight belonged to preparation, and the quiet satisfaction of tactical objectives achieved through patience rather than violence. The Iron Serpents had come to Port Alder believing they could impose their will through fear and intimidation. Instead, they discovered that some prey possessed teeth they never saw coming. The attack came at 0247 hours, with the methodical precision of professionals who'd planned every detail of their assault. Through thermal imaging equipment positioned throughout his property, Jack watched 8 figures approach his house using cover and concealment techniques that spoke of advanced military training. Kane had committed his remaining forces to a desperate gambit: eliminate the threat that had destroyed his operational effectiveness by targeting the family that had become the symbolic center of resistance. But Jack Rourke hadn't survived 4 combat deployments by allowing enemies to choose the terms of engagement. 2 hours earlier, he'd moved Leah and Noah to Miguel's boathouse through routes that avoided every surveillance position the Iron Serpents had established. The house Kane's forces now approached was empty except for carefully prepared surprises that would turn their assault into a nightmare of tactical confusion. "Overwatch in position," Miguel's voice crackled through Jack's earpiece from his elevated post atop the harbor crane. "I count 8 hostiles, full tactical gear, approaching from 3 vectors." "Copy," Jack replied from his concealed position in the neighbor's garden shed. "Let them come." The first surprise activated as Kane's point man reached the front porch. The motion sensor Jack had installed triggered a sequence of lights throughout the house that created the illusion of occupants responding to external threats. But the lights weren't random. They followed the precise pattern military personnel would recognize as coordinated defensive positioning. Through his night vision scope, Jack watched the assault team halt their advance as tactical discipline warred with psychological uncertainty. The house appeared occupied by defenders who were tracking their approach and preparing coordinated response. Thermal shows movement on the 2nd floor. Brick transmitted to his team leader. Multiple contacts dispersed positions. The thermal signatures were heating elements Jack had positioned to simulate human body heat, but the psychological effect was perfect. Kane's assault team was preparing to engage an imaginary defensive force, while the actual threat remained invisible in the shadows around them. Execute breach on my mark. Kane's voice carried deadly determination. Simultaneous entry, 3 points. No survivors. Jack felt the familiar coldness settle over his mind as his targets revealed lethal intent toward his family. For 8 hours, he'd conducted psychological warfare designed to defeat the Iron Serpents without bloodshed. But Kane's decision to assault his home crossed the final line between deterrence and elimination. "Miguel, weapons free," Jack transmitted. "Protect civilian areas. Non-lethal if possible." The second surprise triggered as Kane's team prepared their coordinated breach. Every window in the house suddenly blazed with strobing lights synchronized to the frequency that induced disorientation and temporary blindness. The effect was devastating. Professional operators found themselves stumbling through tactical positions with compromised vision and scrambled spatial awareness. But the strobing lights served a dual purpose. To observers throughout the residential district, the display appeared to be muzzle flashes from automatic weapons engaged in fierce firefight. Within minutes, every civilian within 6 blocks was calling 911 to report major gunfire in the neighborhood. "This is a setup," Brick shouted over tactical radio. "Someone's coordinating police response." Kane's voice carried desperate fury. "Complete the mission! Eliminate the targets!" The assault team's breach attempt became a tactical disaster as they encountered Jack's most sophisticated preparation. The house itself had been turned into a weapon. Tripwires activated flashbang simulators that created disorienting explosions without actual damage. Motion sensors triggered recordings of gunfire that made empty rooms sound like occupied defensive positions. Smoke generators filled corridors with concealment that worked against the attackers while Jack observed their movements through thermal imaging. "Where are they?" Tommy's panicked transmission revealed professional composure completely shattered. "I can't see anything. Someone's shooting from everywhere." Through his scope, Jack watched Kane's assault team stumble through his empty house while engaging phantom defenders, who existed only in sound and tactical illusion. Professional soldiers were being defeated by superior preparation and psychological warfare that turned their own training against them. The third surprise was Miguel's contribution from his elevated position, precision fire that disabled the Iron Serpents, vehicles without targeting personnel. Each shot punctured tires or engine blocks with a surgical accuracy that left escape impossible, while demonstrating restraint that professional soldiers would recognize. "Vehicles compromised," crews reported with the desperation of someone realizing their tactical situation had become untenable. "We're trapped!" But Jack's most effective weapon remained the community response he'd cultivated through weeks of patient preparation. Port Alder's residents didn't hide during the apparent firefight. They emerged to document everything with phone cameras while maintaining safe distances that protected them from actual danger. Detective Mara Ellison arrived with backup units just as Kane's assault team realized they'd been fighting shadows and recordings instead of actual defenders. The tactical situation was perfect from law enforcement perspective. Armed intruders trapped in a house they'd illegally entered, caught in the act of attempted violence against a family that had already evacuated to safety. "All units, drop your weapons and surrender," Mara's amplified voice carried absolute authority. "You are surrounded and have no escape routes." Through his thermal scope, Jack watched Kane's remaining forces face the tactical reality that had destroyed every gang operation they'd attempted. Superior intelligence and community coordination had transformed their assault into public humiliation, while providing law enforcement with overwhelming evidence of criminal intent. Kane to all units. The gang leader's transmission carried the bitter recognition of complete defeat. Mission abort. Surrender to authorities. But surrender wasn't the end of Jack's psychological campaign. It was the final demonstration of strength through restraint. As Kane's assault team emerged from the house with hands raised, Jack remained invisible in the shadows, allowing law enforcement to claim credit for the successful defense. The message was unmistakable. Port Alder's mysterious protectors possessed the capability to eliminate threats, but chose legal resolution over vigilante justice. Professional soldiers would understand that restraint from a position of overwhelming advantage was the most potent form of psychological warfare. "Dad, are you seeing this?" Leah's voice came through the radio from Miguel's boathouse. "Half the town's outside recording everything. It's going to be all over social media in an hour." Jack smiled grimly as he watched Ruth Callahan provide detailed commentary to a growing crowd of neighbors who'd emerged to witness the Iron Serpent's final defeat. The elderly woman's unofficial chronicles would ensure that every detail became part of local legend. "Noah, what's your assessment?" Jack asked his son. "Complete tactical victory," Noah replied with professional detachment that reminded Jack painfully of his own military training. "Enemy force neutralized, civilian casualties 0, community support maximized." The boy was learning lessons Jack had hoped never to teach, but circumstances had forced adaptation. Noah's tactical awareness might prove necessary for surviving in a world where violence remained a constant possibility. As dawn broke over Port Alder, Jack conducted his final assessment from the water tower's elevated position. The Iron Serpent's expansion had been completely destroyed through methods that left no evidence of illegal activity by the town's defenders. Kane and his remaining forces were in custody, facing charges that would ensure lengthy prison sentences. But victory came with the sobering recognition that larger forces remained in play. Kane's superiors would eventually send other operators to investigate the failure of their coastal expansion. Port Alder had won a significant battle, but the war against organized crime would continue beyond their quiet harbor. "Miguel, secure all equipment." Jack transmitted. "Operation complete." "Copy. What about Kane?" Jack studied the gang leader through his scope as police officers secured him in handcuffs. Even in defeat, Kane carried himself with the dangerous competence of someone who'd survived much worse circumstances. Prison wouldn't break him. It would only delay his return to operational status. "Kane's out of play for now," Jack replied. "That's enough." Through his scope, he watched Harpoon emerge from the harbor shadows with a dead rat in his jaws. The scarred tomcat had successfully defended his territory through patience, intelligence, and the willingness to strike when survival demanded it. Jack understood the parallel completely. Some battles were won through overwhelming force, but the most important victories came through superior preparation and the wisdom to know when violence was necessary and when restraint served better purposes. Port Alder was safe, his family was protected, and the community had learned they possessed the strength to resist organized intimidation. For now, that was enough. But as the autumn sun rose over the harbor, Jack remained vigilant in his elevated position, scanning sight lines and calculating distances with the methodical precision of someone who understood that peace was a temporary condition that required constant protection. The longest night was over, but the watch continued. The fog rolled in with the tide at 0530 hours, transforming Port Alder's harbor into a gray maze where visibility dropped to 15 yards and sound carried in deceptive patterns that could make whispers seem like shouts. Victor Kane stood at the end of Pier 7, watching a cigarette boat emerge from the mist like a ghost ship returning from the dead. His extraction had been planned for weeks as a contingency against operational failure, but Kane had never imagined he'd be using it. The Iron Serpent's expansion into coastal territories had succeeded in 7 previous towns through systematic intimidation and superior firepower. Port Alder should have been a simple consolidation, not the tactical disaster that had destroyed his reputation and operational capacity. Boats 5 minutes out, Cruz reported from his position near the harbormaster's office. The last loyal member of Kane's inner circle carried himself with the nervous energy of someone who understood they were retreating from a battlefield, where the enemy remained invisible and undefeated. Kane nodded, studying the harbor's morning shadows with the paranoid awareness of someone who'd learned to fear what he couldn't see. For 3 weeks, Port Alder had felt like enemy territory, where every sight line might conceal a sniper scope, and every civilian could be gathering intelligence for unknown opposition forces. The worst part was the uncertainty. Kane's military experience had taught him to identify and engage enemy forces through conventional tactics, but the resistance he'd encountered defied every operational parameter he understood. Professional-grade psychological warfare combined with community coordination that suggested either extensive law enforcement involvement or the presence of retired military personnel with serious capabilities. Movement on the water tower, Cruz transmitted, his voice tight with the stress of sustained operations in hostile territory. Kane raised his binoculars, scanning the elevated position that had served as an observation post throughout their failed expansion. Nothing visible, but that meant nothing in fog this thick. Whoever had been conducting surveillance might be watching their extraction with the same methodical patience that had characterized every engagement. The cigarette boat materialized from the fog with its engines throttled down to minimum noise, its pilot navigating by GPS and local knowledge rather than visual reference. Kane recognized the vessel from previous operations, fast enough to outrun Coast Guard cutters, equipped with counter-surveillance equipment that could defeat most law enforcement tracking methods. 30 seconds, the pilot announced through encrypted radio, "Be ready to move fast." But as Kane prepared to board the extraction vessel, his tactical instincts triggered a warning that had kept him alive through a dozen combat zones. The harbor felt wrong, too quiet, too controlled, like a battlefield where the enemy had already achieved tactical dominance. "Cruz, something's not right," Kane transmitted. "This feels like a setup." Before Cruz could respond, the cigarette boat's engines coughed, stumbled, then died completely. The vessel drifted toward the pier with the helpless momentum of a ship whose propulsion had been professionally disabled. "Engine failure!" the pilot shouted. "Someone sabotaged the fuel system." Kane's blood turned to ice water as he realized the implications. His extraction had been compromised through intelligence that could only come from electronic surveillance or human assets with access to operational planning. Either possibility suggested opposition capabilities that exceeded anything he'd encountered in previous territories. "All stop." Jack Rourke's voice echoed across the water with the calm authority of someone who controlled every aspect of the tactical situation. "Victor Kane, you're surrounded and have no escape routes." Kane spun toward the voice, his hand moving instinctively toward the concealed weapon beneath his jacket. But Jack's position remained invisible in the fog, the sound seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere like the phantom gunfire that had terrorized his forces for weeks. "Show yourself," Kane shouted into the gray morning. "Face me like a man." "I am facing you," Jack replied, his voice carrying the professional courtesy of one soldier addressing another. "You're in my crosshairs right now, but elimination isn't the objective." Through the fog, Kane caught glimpses of movement that suggested multiple positions occupied by unseen observers. Miguel Santos emerged briefly near the fuel dock, while shadowy figures moved between warehouse buildings with the coordinated precision of a military operation. The psychological pressure was devastating. Kane's military training demanded that he fight or flee, but both options had been systematically eliminated by an enemy who anticipated every tactical decision. He was trapped on an exposed pier with disabled extraction, facing opposition forces whose capabilities remained unknown, but whose preparation was flawless. "What do you want?" Kane called out, his voice carrying the bitter recognition of complete tactical defeat. "Your surrender," Jack replied. "Unconditional, immediate, with full cooperation in dismantling whatever network sent you here." Kane laughed harshly. "You think I'm going to roll over for some small-town mechanic who got lucky?" "Jack Rourke, Gunnery Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines." Jack's voice carried the crisp precision of someone reciting service record. "4 combat deployments, expert marksman qualification, specialist in reconnaissance and counterinsurgency operations. Does that sound like luck to you?" The military credentials hit Kane like a physical blow. Everything suddenly made tactical sense. The professional-grade psychological warfare, the sophisticated preparation, the ability to anticipate and counter every operation the Iron Serpents had attempted. He'd been fighting a decorated Marine sniper who possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain and unlimited time for preparation. "You could have killed me any time," Kane realized. "Multiple times," Jack confirmed. "But dead martyrs create more problems than living prisoners. Your superiors need to understand that Port Alder is permanently off-limits to their operations." Detective Mara Ellison's voice crackled over loudspeakers as police boats emerged from the fog in coordinated formation. "Victor Kane, you are under arrest for racketeering, assault, weapons violations, and conspiracy to commit terrorism. Surrender immediately or face the consequences." Kane studied his tactical situation with the cold assessment of someone who'd survived worse circumstances through pragmatic decision-making. The harbor was completely controlled by opposition forces, his extraction was disabled, and his remaining personnel were either in custody or scattered beyond recovery. But surrender also meant survival, and survival meant eventual return to operational status. Prison sentences could be appealed, reduced, or circumvented through legal maneuvering that his superiors, resources could provide. "I surrender," Kane announced, raising his hands above his head. "But this isn't over, Rourke. My people don't forget, and they don't forgive." "Neither do mine," Jack replied from his invisible position. "Tell your superiors that Port Alder is under permanent protection. Any future operations against this community will be met with escalated response." As police officers secured Kane in handcuffs and read him his rights, Jack remained concealed in the fog, allowing law enforcement to claim credit for the successful operation. His role would never appear in official reports, but Kane would carry the knowledge that he'd been outmaneuvered by superior intelligence and community coordination. The message would spread through criminal networks. Some territories were defended by more than local police, and some quiet coastal towns possessed teeth that predators never saw coming. Later that morning, as the fog lifted to reveal Port Alder's harbor restored to peaceful normalcy, Jack sat with Leah and Noah on the pier where their ordeal had begun 3 weeks earlier. The children had changed during their introduction to tactical reality. Noah carried himself with new awareness of potential threats, while Leah's artistic eye now included assessment of defensive positions and escape routes. "Is it really over?" Leah asked, watching fishing boats return to their normal routines. "This part is," Jack replied honestly, "but there will always be other threats. Other people who think they can take what doesn't belong to them." Noah skipped a stone across the calm water. "Will you teach us more of those games?" Jack smiled, recognizing his son's request for continued tactical training disguised as innocent curiosity. "Some games are worth knowing, even if you hope you never need to play them." Harpoon emerged from behind a stack of lobster traps, the scarred tomcat padding across the pier with the confident stride of an apex predator who'd successfully defended his territory. The old warrior had survived countless battles through patience, intelligence, and the wisdom to know when violence was necessary for survival. Jack understood the parallel completely. Port Alder was safe because its defenders had proven willing to fight for what mattered most: family, community, and the peaceful lives they'd built beside the sea. The harbor's shadows had revealed their secrets, but the town itself remained a sanctuary where good people could raise their children without fear. For a former Marine sniper who'd traded his rifle for boat engines and parent-teacher conferences, that victory was worth more than any medal or commendation. The watch would continue, but the war was over, at least for now. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.